Have you ever been trying to make a decision or deal with a problem and think, I really wish God would just send me an email, because that would make this whole thing a lot easier? Wouldn't that be amazing? Sometimes I just wish it were easier. And it's not. It's just not. I'm sorry about that. Sometimes it's hard enough just to find a few quiet moments to tell God all the stuff that you need to tell God today. All the things you need to ask for, all the people you need to pray for. And sometimes there's just not time at the end of all of that to say, okay, God, now I'm going to listen. Do you ever get impatient for God to answer? Anybody? I mean, I know we don't know. I can't see you again. I know we don't know one another very well yet. And so sometimes it's hard for me and I get impatient. Do you get impatient? Good. I'm glad you get impatient. That makes me feel better. You know, because I say to God, God, I got stuff to do, God. I got a church to build. I got kids to raise. I got laundry to do. I do not have all day, God, so if you could move this along. Anybody ever done your snappy finger thing at God? I don't think we're alone in this. I think that's part of what this psalmist was thinking about, wondering about, worrying about in this psalm this morning. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. And I wonder if the psalmist is just trying to reassure himself by writing this down. I wonder if he's trying to reassure himself because he's like us and not very good at this whole being patient thing. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. How often do you wait in silence? Is that something you do very often? And was the last time intentional, or was it just because your iPhone died on you? And you didn't have Candy Crush to play, or the New York Times to read, or whatever it is you do on your smartphone? I mentioned in my newsletter last week, and I've spoken to many of you about how I'm referring to this process we're on right now as we're getting ready to run a marathon. Now, you'll notice I didn't say we're running a marathon. We're still in the getting ready phase. Because you don't just wake up one morning and decide to throw on your Nikes and go run 26 miles. That wouldn't be very good for most of us. You have to make a plan. And then you have to patiently work your plan. You have to be in training. And that's what we're doing here on this little marathon that we're getting ready to run together. Marathons and training for marathons take tremendous patience. I mean, if you start out on a sprint and you get 10 miles, you're lucky. Getting to the stamina of 26 miles takes time. And so patience is the next step on our training together. We are going to have to be patient with ourselves, with each other, and with God. Now, there's something you should know. I'm not very good always at being patient. Maybe you're not either. It's not really surprising because we live in a culture dominated by instant gratification. Katie mentioned it a second ago in her offering invitation. Gosh, I really need that caffeine. I wish this Starbucks line would move a little faster. See, there you go with your snapping your fingers again. Maybe that's just me. You're standing in front of the microwave waiting on whatever's inside to magically get hot. The internet connection is a little slow today. This red light is always so dang long. Waiting is hard, especially when we're dealing with God. Now, here's my theory on that. See, if we send God an email or a text message if that's your preferred method of communication. We can do that in like 10 seconds, right? Hey, God, got a few things. Going to have a leadership retreat this week here at 46th and Main. Got a couple of questions if you could weigh in on that. I need that by Tuesday at 5:30. Thanks, God. Now, if God just hits us right back with an answer on that deal, that requires nothing of us. Nothing. Except like the 10 seconds that it took us to type that out. But if we have to sit alone and be still, as the song says, and wait in silence, that's a whole different deal. That takes patience and discipline, and those things are hard. Now, one of my mentors often says that prayer and meditation is nothing more than wasting time with God. And I always look at him and say, well, that's great and really extremely unhelpful. Because in our culture, wasting time goes against everything we value as a culture. But I think wasting time is how some of our most important relationships get built. Think about it for a minute. Have you ever sat on your deck watching the sun go down with your spouse or your best friend? Nice glass of wine. Nobody has to say a word. And you just sit there together. And being together in the other's presence is enough. How precious and sacred are those moments? Certainly time well spent, even if it is wasted time. And building that same kind of relationship with God also takes patience and commitment. You have to be intentional about it. Just like building stamina for a marathon, it takes practice and training. Now, that's just the first half of this psalm. And I could sit down, and some of you would like that. But this psalm goes on. And the psalmist, our friend and guide, moves it one step forward. And he makes it more difficult, quite honestly, because then he goes on to say, trust in God. Pour out your heart before God. Now, maybe our high school kids could tell us otherwise, but I don't tend to pour out my heart in a text message. I know the high school kids use text messages a lot more than some of the rest of us, so maybe they have a different perspective on it. But I think pouring out your heart takes trust and time and patience, and it usually doesn't happen with a stranger over a text message. Pouring out your heart takes relationship. And only then can you begin to move forward into what's next. Because it doesn't happen overnight. And it starts with being together. Patiently. I think pouring out a heart is just another way of saying that we're telling our story to one another. And telling our story is a sacred act, and listening to another story is a sacred act. So where do those stories get told? Sacred stories don't happen in the aisle. They don't necessarily happen on the sidewalk outside, although they might. One of those places that I think those stories get told is at the dinner table. Anybody tell stories at the dinner table? I can see you guys better. Anybody tell stories at the dinner table? I still think it's important to sit down at the dinner table. It causes you to slow down, to spend time together. Use a real fork even. And if you have some intentionality around it, you can tell the stories of your day. There's a pastor in Brooklyn doing a new church start. Her name is Emily Scott. And she has centered their whole church, their entire worship, around a dinner table, because that's where she thinks stories best get told. They cook together, then they gather around these small tables. She reads a word of scripture, reflects on it a little bit with them, invites them to reflect on it together, to tell stories. She gives them a little leading question. This is so biblical. She's creating sacred communities around a table telling stories. It's more than just showing up solo, worshiping in your seat solo, heading home solo. It requires a commitment to sometimes 2.5 hours of being together. It requires patient listening and relationship. It's a form, I think, of slower church. There's this movement of slow church. I read a book last year called Slow Church, Cultivating the Patient Way of Jesus. Now, it's similar to what is a little more popular, and you may have actually heard about. It's called the slow food movement. The slow food movement got some press this week. If you saw the president giving out some awards at the White House, he honored one of the slow food movement's founders and most vocal advocates. Her name is Alice Waters, and she has this little restaurant in Berkeley called Chez Panisse. If you've been to Chez Panisse, I want to talk to you. Chez Panisse is in Berkeley, and she was honored by the president this week for her commitment to slowing down the way we eat, the way we look at food, real food, not food that would survive a nuclear holocaust like some of us have in our pantries, but real, live food. Grown locally, sustainably. The slow food movement is not about fast food. And the same way, the slow church is not about a get-quick guide to Jesus or a Cliff Notes version of God. I think one of the questions that the slow church movement asks is, how do we come and find the quiet center from the crowded lives we lead? I think that's a question a lot of people are asking in the midst of busy, busy lives. I think people ask that question because people have real questions, deep questions, because they have real stuff going on in their lives. And they're looking for a place to help sort all that out. I'm looking for a place to help sort all that out. People are looking for a place where they can really be present with people who will really be present to them and listen, and not just give standard issue one-liners that'll get you a soundbite on CNN, but really listening with the patient ear of God. So what does all this mean as we navigate moving forward with what's next? Well, it means, as your pastor, that we're going to slow down. We're going to slow down so that we don't miss where God is calling us to next, because sometimes we are so busy. We rush and we hurry and we run right over the answers that we're looking for. And so I have a challenge for you this week. Homework, yes, I know I've only been here 2 weeks and now I'm giving you homework. I have a challenge for us this week as a community. I want you to take 5 minutes. That's all. I'm only asking for 5 minutes. You got 5 minutes you can give us this week? 5 minutes. Okay. I want you to find a good spot. Maybe it's on your porch. Maybe it's your favorite chair with a cup of tea. Wherever it is, sit. Don't start with your prayer list. Just sit. And say, okay, God, this is your time. I'm just going to sit here and attempt to keep my mouth shut and be still. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. Just sit there And as your breathing begins to slow and your blood pressure lowers, see what happens. What do you hear? What do you feel? See what happens. A few weeks ago, it was the first week of school for our kids. I was tucking Audie into bed, and we were sitting down for our quiet time of reading together, but that night she asked for something different. She asked for something different than our regular Harry Potter or Laura Ingalls Wilder or whatever we happened to be reading that night. She asked for me to tell her a story, but not a made-up story out of a book. She asked me to tell her one of our family stories. She wanted the story of the day she was born. She wanted the story of the day her brother was born. She wanted the story of the day when her daddy asked her mommy to marry him. She wanted our family stories. She loves to hear those stories, and I have come to love telling her those stories. Those stories connect us in a new way every time. And there are nights when, as a mom, I'm tired and I just want to go downstairs and have a moment of peace, but she wants me to tell her a story. I think that's what God wants from us, is to, in the midst of the busyness, just stop and be and share a story. Audrey looked at me when we finally agreed it was time to turn off the lights, and she said, "Mama, I like the stories." You see, the stories connect us. They ground us to what's really important. They build our relationship. Without them, she doesn't know where she comes from, and without them, I forget where I come from. And without them, we forget where we're going together next. Because only when I tell her the stories, when we share together in the stories, can we figure out together where we're going next. What are your stories? The ones that tell you who you really are. The stories of your heart that bubble up during that quiet time with God. The stories that tell you where you came from and where you're going. You see, these stories are so essential for us. They ground us personally and collectively here as a community of faith. And it's those heart stories, they're going to help move us forward together into what's next. As together we listen patiently to our hearts, to the hearts of another, and to the heart of God. For God alone, my soul waits in silence, patiently building the stamina it will take for us to run